I played an entire season of Pokemon Draft League, and today I will be sharing with you 5 things I learned during the season. If you go on to enjoy the video, please leave a like and subscribe. I have a lot of content planned for the upcoming weeks, and I am very excited for it. The Draft League in question was the P4G low tier, and it was an absolute blast. We had a pretty solid team with a lot of Pokemon that performed incredibly well, but also with some members that really let me down. Here was the full roster and their respective stats for the entire season. Hisuian Goodra and Crawdaunt performed amazing, with Goodra being the top kill leader in the league and Crawdaunt ending in the 3rd place. Both Hisuian Goodra and Tornadus Incarnate came to every game, but quite frankly, I was a bit disappointed by Tornadus. There were a lot more good checks to it than I thought when drafting. Although it has excellent coverage and a great speed tier, having to rely on Bleak Windstorm or Hurricane is never fun, and it definitely cost us in our game versus Callum. Palma is definitely on fraud watch after this season, as it just doesn't hit as hard as you want it to, and Double Shock just isn't a great move. You can't really click it twice in a row, which is a huge downside, because it means you can't 2-hit KO a lot of the bulky Pokemon that want to switch in. The rest of the squad though was pretty solid, and I do feel like I underutilized Pokemon like Mesprit, Gligar, and even Muck. Towards the end of the season, they came much more often. My Terra Captains were definitely amongst the worst in the league in my opinion, as Muck was an okay Terra Captain, but Carbink was, let's face it, really bad. I was a little high on the Carbink Copium early during the season, but as the weeks went on, I realized how underwhelming it was. Regardless, we ended with a 6-2 record, which is great, though we did end up losing in round 1 of playoffs. I'll be sharing 5 things I learned over the course of the season, so hopefully you guys can learn with me. First thing I would say is draft the team for you and not so much for the on paper. We all get caught up on fulfilling these essential roles and sometimes don't take into account if it makes for a draft that you will enjoy using or that you are comfortable with. In this season, I was very close to making a couple of changes to the team because there were small things that I really didn't like about my team. The fact my Ghost Resist was a Crawdaunt, the fact my Fairy Resist was a Typhlosion, I didn't like the way Vaporeon made me play, and I couldn't see myself bringing Typhlosion to future matchups anyways. I looked at the board and cooked up a few trades that I thought made my team worse on paper, but would make me feel better about playing and building with it. It would have made my team a bit slower, I'd lose my bulky water, but overall it would have made me feel better about my team's weaknesses. Ultimately, because I was undefeated, I went against those trades, and I do regret it a little bit. I'm not saying to go around and draft a team of only your favorite Pokemon and disregard synergy altogether, but sometimes having a draft that ticks all the boxes on paper isn't actually the best draft for you. Next tip is something that I already knew was very important before the season, but I absolutely need to share it with you guys because I think it's one of the most important things you can do, and that is to have a planned, dedicated lead. Now, this doesn't need to be a hazard setter lead. It could simply be an offensive Pokemon that's just meant to do as much damage as possible, or even a setup Pokemon right off lead. Important thing is that you don't lead with something passive or that immediately puts you on the back foot. If you know and recognize there is a Pokemon on the opposite side that you struggle to deal with, it might be a good idea to lead off with something that won't be forced to switch out in front of it. I usually try to craft and design a dedicated lead when building and planning out the following turns, and I find that that just makes the game much easier to play out. Tip number 3 is one specifically for this season and how I felt in building with the team every week, and that is the fact that neither my Fairy or my Ground type had great offensive capabilities. The amount of matchups where I was like, dang, if I had an offensive Fairy or Ground type, I would be so much better into this team. The fact is, neither Gligar or Carbink can really do immediate damage. I did at some point try to bring Swords Dance Gligar, but it just didn't work out. Fairy and Ground are 2 of the best offensive typings in the game, so not having capable offensive ones did somewhat hurt me during the season. Ideally, you want Pokemon of these types that can contribute both defensively and offensively. Pokemon like Sylveon and Crocodile are good examples of this, and going forward, I definitely want to make sure I can get my hands on specifically Ground and Fairy types that can be offensive as well. Tip number 4 is that Weakness Policy is an incredibly good item. This could even be somewhat linked with tip number 2 of having a dedicated lead, as I often ran my dedicated lead with this item a few times this season. It can immediately put your opponent on the back foot from turn 1. Just in general, Weakness Policy is a great item though, and I'd recommend running it more often if you haven't been doing it. it. It is able to turn a defensive, bulky Pokemon without much offensive presence into a giant threat. I ran this item on Hisuian Goodra a couple times, though it specifically popped off against Uzi in week 7, and I mean, Hisuian Goodra ended up being the top kill leader in the league. When you look at Goodra, you don't immediately think of it as an offensive powerhouse, but weakness policy allowed it to have that insane damage output. I know Joey ran weakness policy on Pecharunt a couple of times as well, and the same logic applies here. Pecharunt is a bulky Pokemon that will be able to, most of the time, live one super effective hit. Slap a weakness policy on it, and all of a sudden, your opponent is in a bad spot. Abusing a Pokemon's defensive capacity to turn it into an offensive threat is insane in such an offensive meta, and I definitely recommend using it when you can. The last tip I have after having played an entire season of Draft League is that Leftovers is often a bad or a suboptimal item. I know at one point Leftovers was considered to be the best item that you could use in competitive Pokemon, but with the current meta being much more offensive than previous ones, you often won't get your full value out of Leftovers. You are better off running other defensive items that can have a much bigger impact in a battle. For example, heavy duty boots, a citrus berry, or even a resist berry. If you want to look at it from the perspective of healing, citrus berry has a much better immediate impact as it's able to heal you for 25% instantly, making you much harder to 2-hit KO. In order for Leftovers to heal the same amount, a Pokemon would need to be in for 4 turns, and in the current meta, this is extremely difficult and dangerous to do. Heavy Duty Boots is also a great shout for a more defensive item, as it can make it so you aren't 2-hit KO'd by certain moves due to ignoring hazard damage. Spike stacking has become such a viable strategy, and with the move being better distributed, a lot of drafts have a couple of spikers on their team. Having Heavy Duty Boots means you can completely ignore this part of your opponent's strategy, giving you better defensive capabilities and extending your longevity. Resist berries are also a good idea as they will reduce damage taken from a super effective hit and can even turn a bad matchup into a not so bad matchup, and you might be able to pick up a surprise kill. Over the course of this season, I found myself not running Leftovers much more often than in the past. I also recently watched a video discussing this in much more detail, and I'll leave it linked in the description down below. The video is by A12 and it does a much better job at explaining why you shouldn't slap Leftovers on every defensive Pokemon. I know I said 5 things, but I'll throw in an extra one to thank you for all the love and support recently. Don't make predictions unless you are behind and need to get back into the game. I often see players, and I still do this myself sometimes, making risky predictions during the early game. Don't get me wrong, sometimes it does work out, but the times it doesn't work out, it can actually cost you the game. It's all about risk versus reward, and sometimes the reward isn't there. Sometimes you are just better off playing it safe during the early game, getting a feel for what your opponent's plan is and what their responses to your threats are, and as the game goes on, you can gradually start making predictions. Now, if you find yourself very far behind, then sometimes you just gotta play a little psycho and pull some crazy plays to get you back into the game. There we have it. Those are 6 things I learned after having played a full season of Pokemon Draft League. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. We also have memberships available if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me. I gave members a little sneak peek last week as to what content I have planned for the next upcoming weeks.